So far we've talked about the mapping project at Dainzú and what we found doing the mapping project. Now I want to talk a little bit more specifically about going further. And in this section, we're going to talk about surface collection and what surface collection means. And so this whole section of the class is about finding archaeological sites and features. So we start with remote sensing. We start with techniques like aerial photography. Then we do survey, which gives us a broad idea. Then we conduct intensive mapping. And then now we still need more information. We can't just go and dig because we think something's cool or whatever. We have to figure out something more. So when I submit for a grant proposal or for a permit, I can say, I have a good idea of the kind of things I'm going to find here, and then these are the questions I want to answer by finding those kind of things. So I'm going to talk about surface collection. And so to date, my projects have focused on the northern part, on the Cerro Danush, as far as going beyond mapping. Only the mapping project has gone beyond Cerro Danush. And technically, if I'm going at the pace I'm going, I could spend the rest of my life and even not get 10% of Cerro Danush excavated. So there's a lot of work to do there. But hopefully my research will help those in the future who want to continue to answer questions there. Okay, so this is the mountain itself, and this is the generalized map that we made of all the features there. And so these are contour lines, so every one of these lines is, I believe, 20 meters, and so as you start down here, you're climbing up 20 meters every time. When those are really tight together, that means something like a cliff. When they're spread out, it's more open and slanted. So here are some of the features that we mapped. All of these blue lines here, these sort of square features, these are all terraces that were built by building a wall. I showed you one of the pictures, and then filling it in with fill to make a flat surface and then building houses on top of it. All of the terraces that we found either maintain ceremonial structures or houses on them on Cerro de Nuche. So quite a lot of people. By about 800 AD, there were quite a lot of people living on Cerro de Nuche, and I'll show you how I know that in a moment. But for the purposes of the mapping project, what we did is we divided up the mountain into groups. And we just gave them names based on their position. So this is the north group, the northeast group, the east group, the north central group, the summit group, the southern group, and the west group. Now remember, these don't have any real significance in the ancient community. They're just arbitrary units that help us identify provenience. Remember that term, provenience, right? I want to know the provenience of all the stuff that's on here. So my first designation was to set up terraces that belonged in these different groups. So then we wanted to do a systematic surface collection. And surface collection is basically just as it sounds, collecting up materials on the surface and then trying to figure out what may be underneath based on what's on the surface. And if you go to any archaeological site, there will always be materials on the surface. You remember we went through those discussions talking about formation processes. So stuff always gets brought to the surface. So if you do a nice surface collection, you will find things and you will see what's there. So once you're at an archaeological site, you want to do what's called a controlled collection, often referred to also as a systematic collection. And so therefore you set up a grid, carefully controlling the proveniences of all the materials, and then you collect up materials within those grids to gain information. When you're collecting a wider survey, so in other words, you want to survey the entire valley of Oaxaca, for example, you can't do a controlled collection. It'll take you years and years and years and years and years. However, you want to get some things off of the surface that give you an idea of when the site was occupied, how long it was occupied for, when it was at its biggest, when it was at its smallest, these kind of things. So what you do is you conduct what's called a grab bag surface collection. And basically, you take a very wide area and you collect up diagnostic materials, so arrow points and ceramic pieces and things like that, but a small group of them, a sample of what's there, basically. So you look on the ground, you see 100 pieces of ceramics, and you see there's 4 kinds of ceramics. So you grab 4 pieces that are best to represent what's in the area, and you put it in a bag. You mark it from the site that you found it using a GPS, and then you can bring it to the lab to talk about when that site was occupied, how long it might have been occupied for, and things like that. That's grab bag. Controlled surface collection, though, is what I'm going to focus on, what we did at Cerro Danouche. So what we did at Cerro Danouche is we tied 2 sticks together by a string that was separated by exactly 4 meters. And what we did is we would put that stake, the first stake, in the ground, and then we'd run the other stake along the ground to make a circle, and we would collect every single thing that was in that circle up, everything on the surface. And how it works, so this is the northeast group and the north central group, and you can see we started out a little bit, how do you say it, we were a little overzealous here. We collected so many circles that we covered almost the entire surface of a terrace. And this was a bit problematic because, first of all, this is the very first terrace we did, and on that day we collected something like 40,000 sherds, and I knew that we were going to be collecting hundreds more terraces, so I had to figure out a better way of doing it. And so you see, instead of sampling so densely, we sampled much less densely moving forward. But it was the same technique. We would take a GPS and mark exactly the UTM coordinates of the center of that circle, and then we would go around and collect everything within that circle. Now, it looks like these 2 circles are overlapping here, and that's actually a glitch with the computer mapping software. On the ground, when we put 2 stakes in like this, we made sure that they didn't overlap like this. So, what can you do? Not everything is perfect. But in any case, we had no overlapping circles actually in the field, and each one of these circles got collected. Each one of these circles had a name on it. All the items from each circle went into an individual Ziploc bag marked with the terrace group, the terrace name, the circle name, and the date. And in this way, we could cover roughly 50% of every terrace. And so this was our surface collection technique. We staked in a thing, circled around it, we covered every single thing that fit within that circle, put it in a bag. We would have 1 bag for lithics, 1 bag for ceramics, 1 bag for bone, and another bag for any other type of object. And then we brought those back into the lab, and then I typed all that data into our geographic information system. Remember, geographic information system. That is when you take data that is tied to a map. So the GPS tied this data to the map. So I know exactly where these circles are on the map, and I know what artifacts were found in these circles. So now I can take that data and examine it. So these are broad images of the map. And these are all the circles, and these are color examples, but these are all the circles that were excavated. And these are ceramics that are early. So remember when we did the ceramics lab, we had those hollow-handled salmadores, and we also had those G23 bowls. So this is the distribution of those early ware ceramics. Those date between 200 and 500 AD. And you can see they're represented, they're definitely here, especially in this group, and this group. They're high densities. So as we go, I don't have the density scale here, but blue is the highest density, then it goes through purple, red, and gets to yellow, and then clear means nothing was found there. So you can see these terraces had very little objects from that period found on them. These terraces, not so much. These terraces, hardly any. These terraces had a lot. This terrace had a lot, and these terraces had a lot. So the earliest occupation of this mountain happened in these parts of the site. These are where the first settlers who built terraces on the mountain lived. But then if we look at the later period, the later ceramics, you can see that they are densely occupied throughout this time period. So every single terrace was built, at least started to be built in this period, but in this period, it became heavily occupied, and all the terraces essentially were built at that point in time. These terraces that are blank and you can't see any dots in them, that's because we weren't able to surface collect them for one reason or another. Either the individual who owned the property didn't allow us to, or there was too much vegetation, and we weren't allowed to shovel test, so we weren't able to to surface collect those places. But we have a good feel here for the occupation of the mountain. And remember, in one of the earlier slides, I had said that the site started to get much higher population and construction of things in this period after 500. Well, here's some data that backs up that hypothesis. So there is some occupation in this 200 to 500 period, but later on it becomes heavily occupied, and so there's a massive population explosion at the site. So one other cool thing we found is I looked into the density distribution of those solid handled salmadores, those pieces you saw in the ceramic lab. These are what some of the other fragments looked like. And this map is black and white, but you can see they were found all over the mountain. Very white means none of them were found. A little gray means a few of them were found. And then black means tons of them were found. Well, there were two areas where we found significant portions of them. And so you can see right here, there were some there and there were some there. By the way, in this time period, the post-classic, the mountain was not occupied anymore. No one was living on the mountain. Everyone was living in where today's community is. But they were coming back and leaving offerings, burned offerings, and they were leaving at the base of this temple right here, which we don't know too much about. We have it mapped and we've surface collected here, but we haven't done any excavation there. So I'm not going to talk much about it. The other spot where they were found in even higher density was at the summit of the mountain. So the summit of the mountain during the classic period, during the time the mountain was occupied, was a center of ceremony. And that continues. And even to this day, people go up there and make offerings. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about it. These were some of those materials. I've already shown this slide before. These were those solid-handled salmadores. This is an image from the Codex Vindobonensis, a Oaxacan pre-Hispanic image showing them burning incense there. This is a contemporary ceremony that takes place where people are leaving offerings of food and they're burning incense. This is another image from the Codex Vindobonensis, and you'll see cross-like things. This is pre-Hispanic. This is before the Spaniards were in contact here. These are cross sticks with flowers tied to them. Here we go again, cross sticks with the flowers tied to them in a contemporary ceremony. And then what happens on Cerro de Nuche? Well, every May 3rd, people make a pilgrimage, and this is a small temple that is built at the summit of the mountain today, on top of that ancient pyramidal platform. And people come up here every May 3rd in the festival of Huitzilopochtli, and that's the name, the Aztec name for the ceremony. And what essentially people do is they all march up on this one day, playing music, burning incense, all kinds of things like that. They come up, and in the evening of the 3rd, they burn incense, they chant, they sing songs, and then in the morning, they have this dance in that plaza. This is that ancient plaza that I was talking about with the mounded walls around it. We're sitting on one of the mounded walls right now and observing the contemporary dance that they take part in during the festival. And so here we see clear connection from the modern day going all the way back into the classic period. This temple patio complex has always been the focus of ceremonies to leave offerings and such that relate to petitioning for a healthy rainy season. May 3rd occurs just before the rains start, and so they would make this trip up there, leave material offerings, and kind of a coincidence is this chapel is the chapel of the Calvary, so the 3 crosses, it's Catholic, so 3 crosses. And remember that the mountain in that 1580 map showed an image. Let me just get back to it if I can. Oh, Professor Falsight. Here we go. So remember, here's the mountain depicted in that image from 1580, and what's at the top of it? that is a cross. So today, there's three crosses, three metal crosses that are in there, and they're petitioning the cross. But clearly, they are petitioning their ancestors and the spirit within the mountain for a healthy rainy season. By the way, this bird up here has to do with origins as well. I can't get too much into that myth, but there's a sacred celestial bird that's often depicted at the top of world trees and things like that, and it relates to an origin of the people. And it's something that's talked about in the Popol Vuh as well. So anyway, that is just some of the ways in which a GIS, a surface collection, and a mapping project can help us understand. And most importantly for my project is essentially all of my hypotheses are developed from this information. This is sort of exploratory research, and then I looked at the distribution of surface artifacts to decide where I was going to excavate. And if you remember, where I excavated, I found a kiln. And the reason why I excavated there is because on the surface, there were what? Wasters, right? You remember the term wasters. So I found a whole concentration of wasters on that terrace when I did the surface collection, and I used this data to form my hypothesis that I would find a production center for ceramics and be able to study ancient economic questions when I proposed for funding, and that's how I got the funding. And so all of this goes together. You start at the high level with mapping and projects that do LiDAR and things like that, where you can do remote sensing. Then you get to the ground, you conduct surface analysis, either surface collection like I did, or geophysical techniques, which is going to be the next topic that we cover.